I've lived with my dad for as long as I can remember. My mother died when I was only 4 years old, and since then our house has become for me not just a place where I lived, but a whole world, limited by its walls, saturated with memories of the past, of a voice that I hardly remembered, of smells that have long disappeared, and of warmth, which remained only in his father's stories. The house belonged to my grandparents, my mother's parents, but after her death they shut themselves in, rarely visited us, and when they did, their visits were short, full of strange silence, avoiding eye contact and avoiding talking about her. It seemed to me that they were not so much grieving as they could not come to terms with her loss, and for them I was a living reminder of the daughter they had lost. My father didn't have a relationship for a long time. There were rare meetings, short dates, from which he returned thoughtful, with a slight shadow of fatigue in his eyes. I was 12 when I first noticed that he began to pay attention to other women. He met for a cup of coffee, sometimes at dinner with someone in a restaurant while I stayed at home with the babysitter. But none of these women showed up at our house, no one stayed longer than a few meetings, and it seemed that my father himself had no particular interest in this relationship. He continued to live only for me, giving me all his care and attention, and I got used to the fact that the two of us are a little family that no one can replace. But everything changed when I turned 14. By that time, Grandma and Grandpa had already died, and my father and I were left alone in the big house. I didn't feel lonely, but rather, on the contrary, I enjoyed peace, silence, and a measured life where everything remained in its place, where every day was clear and predictable. However, it was then that her father met her. "Roxy, dear, I want to introduce you to someone special," he said one evening. His voice was steady, but I immediately noticed something strange in his expression, a slight nervousness, some kind of expectation, as if he was afraid that my reaction might disappoint him. She was standing next to him, tall, elegant, and well-groomed to the smallest detail. Her blonde hair was immaculately styled, her nails were varnished in a neutral shade, and she wore expensive jewelry on her slender wrists. There was something practiced in her manner, as if this meeting was nothing more than a carefully planned step in a series of many similar ones. "This is Sandra," my father said, squeezing my fingers in his palm, but my attention was no longer focused on her, but on those who stood behind. "These are my children." Sandra's voice was even and polite, but there was no warmth in it. "James is a freshman in college, and this is Melissa, who's 16. James, tall and thin, barely glanced in my direction, nodded casually. His attention immediately returned to the phone, which he deftly controlled with one hand, clearly not wanting to get involved in the conversation. Melissa, on the other hand, looked at me attentively, with narrowed eyes, and her smile was one that might have seemed friendly if not for the slight sneer at the corners of her lips. "Hi," she said, and I replied in kind, but later, when the day was coming to an end, she cornered me in the kitchen, crossed her arms over her chest and coldly said, "Let's make a deal right away. Our parents can date, get married, do anything, but that doesn't make us sisters, friends, or anything else. We're keeping our distance, okay?" I didn't say anything, but my stomach clenched. 6 months have passed, and everything happened too fast. My father and Sandra got married, and the three of them moved into our house. Yesterday's shelter, spacious and full of light, suddenly became cramped, filled with other people's voices, smells, and habits that were incomprehensible to me. James took over the guest room, Melissa got an office turned into a bedroom, and Sandra's belongings seemed to multiply overnight, filling all the available surfaces. The bathroom turned into a war zone. Either Sandra spent hours there doing her beauty treatments, or Melissa locked herself in for long minutes, taking endless selfies. I started getting up an hour earlier to take a shower, but even that didn't make me want to complain. I saw how my father's face lit up when Sandra came into the room, how he started humming to himself while preparing breakfast, how he came home from work on time to spend the evening with us. He was happy, really happy for the first time since his mother died. And then everything changed again. My father got a promotion, and that evening, when he entered the house, His eyes were shining and his smile was so wide that I immediately realized he was really happy. Regional Sales Director, he proudly announced at dinner. Can you believe it? Sandra had immediately started talking about buying a new car and renovating the kitchen, discussing the details as if she had been preparing for this for a long time. But I got caught up in something else. He casually mentioned long trips. Long business trips. That he's going to be gone for weeks, maybe months. And then I realized that our lives were changing again, and this time I had to deal with it alone. When her father first went on a business trip, the change in Sandra happened instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch, and the benevolent, affectionately tired expression she wore in his presence evaporated, giving way to something cold, stern, alien. The moment my father's car disappeared around the bend, she turned to me, and in her eyes I saw something I had never noticed before, a firm, uncompromising determination. "Roxy," she said in a flat, dry voice that held no hint of warmth. "We need to set some ground rules for the duration of your father's absence." I nodded silently, but even then I felt an uneasy premonition, a premonition that soon came true. These basic rules turned out to be nothing more than a long, exhausting list of duties and prohibitions that subjected my life to a strict schedule, eliminating from it even the few joys that I had. I had to return home strictly by 4:30 p.m., with no exceptions, even if it was about exam preparation, school activities, or, what especially upset me, volleyball practice, which took place on Thursdays. "But I have training." I tried to object, hoping for at least a little understanding. Sandra didn't even flinch, continuing to stand straight, frowning in a stern expression. "Then you'll have to leave the team," she replied without a trace of regret, as if it were an insignificant decision that had no impact on my life. Impotent irritation gripped me, but I knew it was useless to argue. In addition, the list of roles included household duties, helping with dinner, cleaning rooms, mopping floors, wiping windows, keeping order in the pantry. All this fell solely on my shoulders. For the first few days, I literally ran into the house, out of breath after school, dropping my backpack at the door, barely catching my breath before Sandra started giving orders. "Are the floors cleaned, Roxy? The windows are dirty, put them in order. Chop the vegetables for dinner. Hurry up, don't be late." At this time, Melissa was lounging on the couch, stretching her legs and casually flipping through the tape on her phone, giggling at messages from her many fans. James, in turn, was rarely at home, but even when he appeared, he just lazily threw dirty dishes into the sink and left his laundry to someone else, not even bothering to show minimal independence. One evening, when I was standing over the sink, washing the pots of dried leftovers, and Melissa was watching a video on TikTok at full volume, I couldn't stand it. "Why shouldn't Melissa help with any of this?" I asked, barely hiding my annoyance. Sandra, who was idly flipping through a magazine at that moment, looked up from the page and looked at me with mild surprise, as if I had said something completely ridiculous. "Melissa needs to focus on college prep," she replied coldly, as if that explained everything. "She can't waste time on household chores." Stunned, I looked at Melissa, who was filming herself on the front camera, dancing in another trending video. "But she's..." I began, but stopped when I heard that special, warning note in Sandra's voice that clearly said that continuing the argument wouldn't bode well for me. I gritted my teeth and went back to the dishes, but inside I was seething with injustice. However, that wasn't even the worst part. I didn't have heavy, endless responsibilities, or the role of a servant in my own home. The worst part was watching Sandra transform every time her father called or returned home. As soon as he crossed the threshold, her posture changed, and her face took on an expression of fatigue and slight doom. She sighed heavily, sank wearily into a chair, as if she had spent all her strength taking care of the house that day, and said, "Oh, honey, you have no idea how hard it was. Manage the house alone, take care of everything." And her father, a sweet, naive father, believed her. He kissed her on the forehead, sincerely sympathizing, and then took out some kind of gift from his suitcase, a designer handbag, expensive perfumes, jewelry that cost more than all my things combined. "You're doing so well," he said admiringly, watching Sandra look at her new trophy with a satisfied smile. "I did not know what we would do without you," he added, looking around the table, but his words were always addressed only to her. I stood to the side, my hands were still wet from cleaning, the list of unfulfilled homework was spinning in my head, and a dull feeling of injustice was growing in my chest. Sometimes I caught Melissa's gaze on me, her light, mocking grin, and I realized that she was well aware of the absurdity of the situation. But she was in an advantageous position. She didn't have to prove anything. I could have said something. "Open your mouth, say what I think. Tell your father what happens when he's not at home." But I saw how happy he was. I saw him laughing at dinner, looking at Sandra with love, and believing her. And she understood that there was no point in talking. He wouldn't have believed it. The years crept by like thick syrup trickling down the walls of a glass vessel, slowly, inexorably, leaving sticky traces of memories behind, and before I knew it, I found myself in my senior year of high school, standing on the threshold of adulthood, which seemed to be impatiently knocking on the door, demanding to accept it with all the obligations, worries and worries. James had already graduated from college 2 years ago, but he still stayed in the house, explaining his presence by saying that he was looking for a suitable job opportunity, which in fact meant endless hours spent playing video games in his room, rare interviews that, for some mysterious reason, never ended in success, and lazy trips to the fridge in search of something delicious. Melissa was a third-year student at a local college, which also meant her constant presence in the house, her dominance over the bathroom, her absence from the kitchen, the laundry room, anywhere that needed at least some help around the house. She still spent most of her time in her room, sorting out outfits, doing makeup, creating flawless looks for her many followers on social media, and nothing seemed to shake her confidence that home was a place where everything was done for her, but not by her. My 18th birthday came early in the spring, and I didn't expect much. Sandra has made it clear that there is no need for excessive celebrations. "We're just going to have a little family dinner," she announced, without taking her eyes off the phone screen. Her voice was indifferent, as if it wasn't about an important milestone in my life, but about some boring commitment that I couldn't get away from. No need to spend money on a big party. I tried not to think about Melissa's 18th birthday 2 years ago, and the magnitude of the event. Back then, Sandra spent weeks carefully planning every detail, arranging the rental of the hall, ordering catering, hiring a professional DJ, inviting about 100 guests, and all this was presented as something natural, non-negotiable. But I had to settle for a family dinner. Fortunately, Dad was at home that evening, and even though he had to go on a business trip again the next day, I appreciated at least those few hours with him. "I'm sorry, Princess," he said, hugging me before leaving. His voice was genuinely warm, but there was a hint of guilt in it. "Work calls. We'll celebrate properly when I get back." I nodded, trying to keep a polite smile on my face, and focused on getting ready for graduation, on applying to college, on ordering graduation robes, on all those little things that made up the picture of my last year at school, creating the illusion of normalcy. But everything changed one evening when Dad was already away. We were sitting at the table, me, Sandra, James, and Melissa. I was shoveling peas around my plate with a fork without much appetite, trying to ignore Melissa's endless chatter about her latest drama with her boyfriend, when Sandra cleared her throat. "Roxy," she said, folding her hands on the table. Her voice was soft, but there was a wary tension in it. "We need to have a serious conversation." I raised my head, trying to guess what it would be about. Perhaps she wants to discuss my college plans? So far, I've avoided talking to her about this topic, but maybe she's finally decided to show some interest in my future. "Now that you're 18, she continued, smiling that sickly sweet smile that made my insides tighten, "you're legally an adult. And adults have responsibilities." She paused, giving me a chance to realize what was coming next, and only then added, "Starting next month, you will need to pay the rent. $500 a month seems fair, doesn't it?" I literally choked on my food. James, who was sitting next to me, slapped me on the back, grinning as if what was happening was just a funny prank. "What?" I finally exhaled, feeling a wave of shock rising inside. I looked around the table. James continued to grin. Melissa barely concealed her pleasure at the situation, as if anticipating my reaction, and only Sandra remained absolutely calm, looking at me with the same soft but firm confidence with which people explain simple truths to children. "What happens if I can't pay?" I asked, trying my best to keep my voice level. Sandra tilted her head slightly to one side. Her smile became a little wider, but colder. "Well, then you'll have to find another place to live, won't you? We can't afford freeloaders in this house." I sat at the table, feeling Sandra's words hang in the air like an invisible weight pressing on my chest. Helplessness, anger, confusion, everything was mixed up in me as I tried to make sense of what I had heard. Years of humiliation, endless housework, contempt from her children, the feeling that I was just an extra person in this house, who was allowed to live here only because my father wanted it, all this surfaced in my memory, intertwining into a single realization. Something inside me finally broke. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange, icy clarity in my thoughts. "Let me get this straight," I said, trying not to show my emotions. "James, who graduated from college 2 years ago and spends his days playing video games, doesn't pay rent. Melissa, who is in college and has never helped around the house in her life, doesn't pay either. But should I?" Sandra calmly dabbed her lips with a napkin before answering. "I've decided that my children don't have to pay rent until they're settled in." A strange calm descended upon me the moment I heard Sandra's words, and perhaps it was the result of all these years of pent-up disappointment, that dull, viscous feeling of injustice that swelled and swelled every year, threatening to tear me apart from the inside one day. Or maybe it was just time for the truth to come out, breaking the precarious balance that I've been maintaining for so long. I suddenly felt myself smiling, but not with the smile I was used to responding to another unfair decision, not with the weak, tired expression I used to try to maintain the illusion of peaceful coexistence in this house, but with something else, new, firmer, something that made Sandra's lips twitch for a moment, before she regained her confidence. "Well, that's interesting," I said, leaning back in my chair, giving myself time to savor their reactions. "I won't pay the rent because it's my house." There was a moment of silence, so thick that I could have sworn I could hear the wind stirring the branches of an old maple tree in the courtyard. And then there was laughter. First James, a short, mocking laugh, then Melissa's bubbly, almost hysterical laugh, and then Sandra joined them, but her laugh sounded sharper. There was something strained, unnatural in it, something that betrayed her growing concern. "What are you talking about?" "What is it?" she asked through laughter, shaking her head as if I had just told a ridiculous joke. I wasn't laughing. "This house belongs to me," I repeated, and this time my words sounded like a hammer blow, loud, without hesitation, without a hint of a joke. "It belonged to my grandparents, and before they died, they transferred it to my name." The laughter stopped. James and Melissa froze, exchanging puzzled glances, as if they didn't fully understand what was happening, but on Sandra's face, emotions alternated with each other at an alarming rate, first amusement, then confusion, then disbelief, and finally something very similar to panic. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, grabbing the phone like it was a lifeline. "I'm calling your dad right now." Her manicured nails tapped nervously on the screen as she turned on the speakerphone. The beeps filled the kitchen, stretching out this moment of suspense like a long, agonizing note in a symphony of tension. "Hi," his father's voice finally came, crackling slightly from the speaker. "David," Sandra's voice was tightly controlled, but I detected a metallic tinge of annoyance in it. "Roxy is telling some strange stories about the house that she claims belongs to her." That's not true, is it? There was silence on the other end of the line, so thick that I had to strain my ears to hear my father exhale softly. Actually, his voice sounded cautious, with just a hint of doubt. Yes, it's true. Maya's parents registered the house in Roxy's name before they died. I didn't think it was important. I didn't think it was worth mentioning. Sandra made a short, high-pitched sound that sounded like laughter or protest. How could you not tell me that? Stop it, she almost shouted, and for the first time in a long time there was no usual sweet politeness in her voice. I didn't think it was important, my father repeated, and there was something confused in his voice, as if he had just realized the consequences of his silence. Doesn't matter? Sandra almost choked with indignation. Doesn't it matter that your teenage daughter owns our house? She furiously pressed the end call button without even waiting for an answer, and almost threw the phone on the table, as if it was to blame for her current situation. There was silence in the kitchen. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator, measured, indifferent, as if the house itself was enjoying this moment of exposure. James and Melissa looked at me with their eyes wide open, as if they had seen me for the first time, as if over the years I had been a shadow to them, a part of the interior, something insignificant that suddenly found a voice. Sandra took a few deep breaths, clearly trying to pull herself together, and then she laughed tightly, but her laughter sounded more like a hiccup, like a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Well, she drawled, forcing out another awkward laugh. It was all a big misunderstanding. Of course you don't have to pay rent, Roxy. Let's just forget about this conversation, okay? I looked at her, and there was no doubt left in me. Everything that had happened over the years, the endless responsibilities, the unfair treatment, the contempt of her children, the lies, the manipulations, all flashed through my mind, covering me with an icy wave of awareness. She didn't take care of me. She never considered me part of the family. All this time, I was just an obstacle for her, an annoying reminder that this house, this life, this cozy little world that she had built, had never truly belonged to her. No, Sandra, I said softly but firmly, and her face paled slightly. We will not forget this conversation. I got up and left the kitchen, heading for the stairs, and had barely reached the second floor when I heard an urgent whisper from below, Sandra's sharp, strained voice, in which anger boiled, mixed with James' bewilderment and Melissa's indignant snort. They clearly did not expect such a turn of events. Their prosperous, comfortable world had just cracked, and now they were feverishly looking for a way to glue it back together, to keep it in the usual framework, where everything revolved around their needs, and I remained in the role of an inconspicuous maintenance staff. But now everything has changed. I closed the door to my room and lay down on my bed, staring at the ceiling while the heated, muffled arguments continued downstairs. By 6 a.m, I was already awake, just lying there, listening to the steady ticking of the clock, thinking about how quickly the usual balance of power collapsed, how everything turned upside down in just a few hours. By 7, I heard movement below. The refrigerator door slammed, the coffee machine rumbled, and there was the soft clink of a spoon on porcelain, the familiar sounds of Sandra's morning ritual. I was about to go downstairs when I heard her voice, low but tense, steeped in controlled irritation. David, you need to do something about this situation, she said. I froze on the stairs, holding my breath to hear better. Your daughter can't just. Sandra paused, as if searching for the right words, and then abruptly continued, we need to make her leave. My throat is dry. I know this is her house, David. Her voice became even more urgent, almost pleading, but at the same time soaked with irritation. But she complicates everything. She doesn't fit in here anymore. She's becoming a problem. There was a pause, heavy and oppressive. I knew my father was thinking, and I could hear his deep breaths even from where I stood. Sandra, this is her house, he finally said, and there was a note of uncertainty in his voice that made my insides clench. I can't just kick her out. No one is talking about kicking her out. Sandra immediately changed her tone. Her voice became sickly sweet, soft, enveloping, the way she used to manipulate people. We just need to steer her in the right direction. What about the colleges she applied to? Aren't they in other states? You could convince her to enroll in one of them. Tell her that it will be good for her independence. I gritted my teeth. My father hesitated, and that short moment was enough for me to realize that he was already hesitating, already considering this option, already beginning to see my departure as a convenient solution to the problem. Maybe you're right, he finally breathed out, and there was something doomed in his voice. I'll talk to her about moving to college. It might be better for everyone. It's better for everyone. I waited until Sandra hung up the phone before slowly going down to the kitchen, keeping an unreadable expression on my face. I opened the cupboard, took out a bowl, poured cereal, poured milk over them, pretending that I hadn't heard anything. A few minutes later, James and Melissa shuffled into the kitchen, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere but here. Sandra was the last to arrive, her phone still in her hand, and she had a beaming, fake smile on her face designed to erase the events of last night. "Good morning, everyone," she sang with deliberate cheerfulness, sitting down at the table as if nothing had happened. We all sat in silence. The only sound was the crunching of cereal and the occasional clink of spoons against bowls. Sandra took a sip of coffee, Melissa lazily scrolled through her phone, James absently picked at his breakfast, and everything in this moment looked almost normal, as if last night could be erased from reality, pretend that nothing had changed. I let this illusion hang in the air for a couple more seconds, and then, as casually as if I were just commenting on the weather, I said, "By the way, starting next month you'll all have to pay rent." Sandra's toast froze halfway to her mouth. James dropped his phone right into his cereal bowl. Melissa's spoon fell out of her hands with a loud clatter and bounced on the table. "Excuse me?" Sandra's voice sounded low, almost hoarse, as if the air had suddenly left her lungs. I took another bite of cereal, chewed slowly before repeating. "Rent. I think $500 per person would be a fair amount. After all, that's what adults do, right? They pay for their accommodation." Sandra's face turned pale at first, then blotched and blushed sharply. She coughed, clearly inhaling some coffee, and grabbed a napkin to wipe her mouth, her eyes frantically darting from one to the other, as if she was looking for support. "This is," she began, but her voice faltered and she couldn't finish the sentence. I put down my spoon, bent over her, and calmly, slowly, watching with obvious pleasure as her face contorted with shock, I added, "Oh, and don't worry, I'm not talking about kicking you out. We'll just point you in the right direction. After all, as you said yourself, it's time to become independent." "You can't be serious." Sandra looked at me with an expression of utter bewilderment, but the first flickers of panic were already frozen in her eyes, as if she couldn't believe that all this was really happening, that her carefully constructed order of things had collapsed in a matter of moments. "Oh, I'm very serious," I replied, continuing to stir the cereal in the bowl, not even bothering to look at her. But we're a family," she muttered, and her composure cracked like a thin layer of ice that suddenly began to form a network of thin cracks. "The family does not charge rent. That's not how it works." "Didn't you just demand that I pay the rent yesterday?" I asked, keeping my outward composure, although inside everything in me was rejoicing, enjoying the rare opportunity to finally put her in her place. Sandra's face flushed, and she abruptly set her coffee cup down on the table, so that dark drops splashed onto the white tablecloth. "This is different," she exclaimed, her voice breaking, and she swallowed convulsively, trying to regain control of the situation. "I was trying to teach you financial literacy, to prepare you for the real world." I couldn't help but laugh, but there was no mirth in that laugh, just bitter amazement. "Financial literacy? The real world?" I repeated, shaking my head. "Are you saying this to me, a man who has been doing all the housework since the age of 14, while you and your children live here, without paying for anything? A man who has been working part-time for the last few years in order to somehow save for the future while your son spends his days playing video games? Listen here, James began, leaning forward, but I cut him off abruptly. No, you listen, I snapped, and he froze, not expecting such a tone. You graduated from college 2 years ago. You don't have a job. You spend all day playing video games and eating food that I buy, working after school. Maybe it's time for you to learn what financial literacy is, too. I turned to Melissa, who had been maintaining an appearance of detachment, lazily picking at her breakfast, but now her fingers were clutching the spoon convulsively. And you? When was the last time you washed your own clothes or cooked your own food? How dare you? Sandra screamed, her voice soaring an octave higher. After all I've done for this family. What exactly did you do? I asked, and there was genuine curiosity in my voice. You made me do all the housework while your kids were messing around? Was she trying to force me to pay rent for my own house? And then, when that didn't work, did you and Dad plan to get rid of me? Sandra's eyes widened, her face turned ashen gray, and her lips trembled, as if she couldn't believe I'd actually heard that conversation. You were eavesdropping? I heard everything, I confirmed, pushing my bowl away. And you know what? Maybe you're right. Maybe it's really time to change something. So here are your options, either you all start paying rent, or you find another place to stay. Sandra's face turned alarmingly red. She didn't even try to hide her rage. This is revenge, right? Her voice was trembling with suppressed anger. You're just a mean, cruel kid who's jealous of my kids. Melissa finally woke up from her shock and, crossing her arms over her chest, grinned. Or what? Are you going to kick us out? Her voice was full of venom. You ungrateful little snake, James added, standing up so abruptly that his chair fell back with a crash. We have accepted you into our family. Into your family? My voice was flat, almost lazy, but that seemed to make them even angrier. This is my house. My grandparents' house. You're the one who moved here, remember? Sandra clenched her teeth, her hands clenched into fists. You're going to regret this, she hissed, pushing away from the table so abruptly that the coffee cup tipped over, spilling onto the tablecloth. You have no idea what you're doing. She turned to her children. James, Melissa, get your things. We're leaving. I watched in silence as they ran up the stairs, slamming the doors loudly, their voices merging into a chaotic hum full of indignation and anger. Sandra lingered in the doorway, looking at me with hatred. Her gaze was full of venom, promises of revenge, threats that she seemed to be holding back with the last of her strength. Your father will hear about it, she spat. I didn't even flinch. I'm counting on it, I replied calmly. She glared angrily and turned on her heel, disappearing around the bend. For the next hour, I sat at the table, finishing my now soaked cereal, while from above I could hear the rumble of drawers being pulled out, angry shouts, and the sound of suitcases dragging on the floor. When they finally came downstairs, each with several bags, I didn't say a word. Sandra, James, and Melissa left the house without looking back. I heard the front door slam, Sandra hissing to her children, and the engine of her car starting. And then there was silence. Real, deep, pure silence. And for the first time in many years, this house belonged to me again. The house seemed strange in its newfound silence, as if the walls, accustomed to constant noise, chatter, irritated shouts, and endless steps up and down the stairs, suddenly froze in anticipation of new sounds, but there were none, and this made the space feel almost unreal. I wandered from room to room, straightening the things they had left in a hurry, trying to make sense of everything that had happened in the last 24 hours, but my awareness of what was happening still seemed blurry to me, as if I were watching events from the sidelines, like the scenes of a movie in which my own life was only part of the script. It wasn't until the middle of the day that the phone rang, and I jumped in surprise, as if a sharp sound had intruded into this new, unusual peace. I looked at the screen and saw my father's name flash on the display, and before answering, I took a deep breath, trying to prepare for what he would say. "Hello? What the hell are you doing?" His voice literally exploded over the speaker, and I had to pull the phone away from my ear so as not to go deaf. I didn't say anything, letting him talk, because I knew he wasn't going to listen right now. He just wanted to vent all the anger Sandra had probably fanned in him. "Sandra just called me in hysterics. How could you be so cruel?" Something inside me snapped. After many years spent trying to keep the peace, in endless silence, in the desire to be a good daughter, to please, to give in, to endure, to smooth out the rough edges, I had enough. "Cruel?" I interrupted him in the middle of his tirade, and my voice, though calm, sounded like steel. "That's interesting, Dad. And where was all that concern about cruelty when your wife tried to charge me rent for living in my own house? Do you think it was cute?" There was silence on the other end of the line, and when my father spoke again, his voice was quieter, uncertain. "What are you talking about?" "Sandra never." "Don't you dare pretend you didn't know." My voice was trembling now, not from fear, but from pent-up anger. "Don't you dare pretend you don't know. I heard you talking to her on the phone this morning when she was trying to convince you to make me move out, and you agreed. Do you remember that conversation, Dad?" The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically see him squirming, his face furrowed with tension, searching for the right words, as he always did when he was caught in a lie. "Roxy, darling, you don't understand." He sighed, as if he was going to explain something difficult to me, but then, as if pulling himself together, he made his voice hard again. "You're destroying this family, Roxy. Is that what you want? Sandra is threatening to divorce me because of this." I slowly sank down onto the couch, the same couch Melissa had sprawled on for hours while I cleaned, cooked, washed the dishes for everyone, and did my part of the housework. "Is she saying she's going to divorce you if I don't apologize?" My voice was empty, as if I already lacked emotion. "Sorry about what, Dad? For owning my own house? For being able to defend my rights?" "She's my wife," his father's voice faltered, but he tried to sound firm. "She says that either you apologize for the way you treated her and her children, or she leaves me. Is that what you want, Roxy? Do you want to ruin my marriage?" I looked around the living room, and I suddenly felt uneasy about how little of me and my real family was left in this house. There were photographs on the walls, mostly family portraits of Sandra, James, and Melissa, their happy smiles looking at me from every corner, while all that remained of my mother was one small photograph, forgotten in the shadow of a large bookshelf. I swallowed the lump in my throat, but my voice was steady when I finally replied. "I'm not apologizing, Dad. Not for that." The line broke. He hung up the phone. My graduation came and went like a blur. The ceremony was beautiful, bright, and festive, but the empty seats in the hall reserved for the family felt like a physical weight on my chest. The parents of my best friend Sarah, smiling, took pictures of us together, invited me to their festive dinner, surrounded me with warmth and care, but I felt that they perfectly understood why my father did not come. They didn't say anything about it, but their hugs lasted a little longer than usual, and their smiles were a little softer than usual. I spent the next few days sorting through college application letters, trying to decide what to do next, mentally trying on possible futures for myself. The house seemed both empty and peaceful, and I began to get used to this new state of things, to this freedom that now belonged to me. And then, one hot summer day, when I was sitting by the window with a cup of coffee and rereading letters, a familiar car pulled into the driveway. I froze, watching as she slowly rolled up to the house. My heart suddenly began to beat faster, my fingers tightened around the mug, because I knew that now everything had to be finally decided. Dad went out first, his steps resolute, his shoulders tense, his eyes cold, as if he had already made some final decision for himself and now just intended to voice it to me. Sandra, James, and Melissa followed him like faithful shadows, all three immaculately dressed, with equally stern expressions on their faces, as if they were heading not to a relative, but to an important business meeting where they needed to settle a contract that they were sure they could outplay in their favor. I met them at the door before they could knock. "Roxy," Dad said, his voice dry and formal, pronouncing my name as if we were barely familiar people. Sandra was standing behind his shoulder, head slightly tilted, nodding encouragingly, as if she controlled his every move, every word, every expression with invisible threads, and this realization hit me deeper than I expected. "We have come to resolve this situation," he continued, choosing his words carefully, as if he had rehearsed this speech in front of a mirror in advance. I silently leaned against the door frame, arms crossed over my chest, and waited. "I'm ready to forgive your recent behavior," he said evenly, but I could see how tightly his fingers were clenched, betraying carefully concealed anger. "We can all go back, and everything can be the same as before. But you need to apologize to Sandra and her children for the way you treated them, and, of course, give up this ridiculous idea of renting." I looked at their faces, and all the years I'd spent in the shadow of their demands, their whims, their indifference to how I felt flashed before my eyes. The tight smile of his father, the smug grins of James and Melissa, full of the same confidence that they would be able to turn the situation in their favor again. Memories flashed back, one after the other, countless evenings when I washed the dishes for them while they mindlessly scrolled through their phones, morning rushes to the bathroom because Melissa had more important things, days when I came home knowing that new errands were waiting for me while they were doing nothing. I saw Dad slowly but inexorably turning into a stranger, becoming more and more distant, becoming part of their family, but not mine. "No," I said simply. The facade of the father cracked. "Then you leave me no choice." His voice became sharper, tense wrinkles appeared on his forehead. "If you can't be reasonable, if you don't want to be a part of this family, then I'm done. I'm leaving and renouncing you. Is that what you want?" I felt a strange, icy calmness. "It's your choice, Dad," I said, not taking my eyes off him. "You have long made it clear who you chose, your wife and her children instead of me. You've been doing this for years." Sandra gasped, and the sound was so fake, so forced, that I wasn't even surprised. "How dare you, you ungrateful little witch!" Her voice rang with rage. "You've always been jealous of my children, you've always tried to come between us and your father." I pulled out my phone and, looking her straight in the eye, calmly said, "One more word, and I'm calling the police for harassment. Your choice." The threat worked faster than I thought. Sandra stopped abruptly, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes blazed with hatred, but she didn't say another word. Dad turned around without a word and, without looking at me, began to pack up the few things he had left here. James and Melissa didn't say anything either, just stood with their arms crossed and expressions of ill-concealed malice. In tense silence, my father packed his things into boxes and carried them to the car, and I watched without saying a word. When he took his last walk around the house where he raised me, he didn't even say goodbye. Neither did any of them. They just got in the car and drove away, leaving nothing but tire tracks in the driveway. 3 months ago. Now I'm writing this from my dorm room at Northwestern University, more than 1,000 miles from home. The house that was once mine is now under the management of Anderson Real Estate, and they have found good tenants, a young family with 2 little girls who filled the walls with new laughter and life. The rental income not only covers all my college expenses, but it also allows me to focus on my studies without worrying about money, and I feel like every day is a step towards something bigger, something that belongs only to me. I sometimes hear fragmentary information about my father through mutual acquaintances. He now rents a small 3-room apartment on the other side of the city, still works in his prestigious position, still receives a good salary, but it seems he no longer looks as happy as before. Sandra, of course, did the renovation she dreamed of: new granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, just not in your home. James finally got a job, but from what I hear, he's still living with them, and Melissa dropped out of college, but now runs a fashion blog and seems to be enjoying it. They live their lives, and I live mine. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I flip through old photos, the ones that were taken before Mom died, when Dad still smiled so that this smile touched his eyes, when family meant something else. Sometimes I think, is it possible that one day we will become father and daughter again? Does he think about me? Does he regret his choice? Does he miss me as much as I sometimes miss him? Maybe one day he'll realize what he's lost. Maybe someday we'll find a way to repair what's broken between us. Or maybe not. Anyway, now I know, I'm stronger than I ever imagined.